Book Fair podcast. My name is Anthony, and this show is all about the freedom to read and children's literature. This week, we have an interview with Angie Hayden from Read Freely, Alabama, as well as a brief look at some legislation pre-filed in the state of Texas for the 2025 legislative session that could be impacting public schools and libraries. There will be no new episodes for the next couple of weeks for the holidays. I will be returning in the new year with some interesting episodes, as well as who President Donald J. Trump selects to head the Department of Education. We will be beginning first with an interview from Angie Hayden from Read Freely, Alabama. So, Angie, would you like to start by introducing yourself and telling the audience a little bit about what Read Freely, Alabama is all about?
Sure. I'm Angie Hayden. I have lived in central Alabama for the majority of my life. I've raised my children here. And about a year and a half ago, Prattville, my hometown, sort of became what we call ground zero for the book banning efforts here in Alabama. A group that called themselves at the time Clean Up Prattville started challenging books in our local public library, which is a little different than most states. They seem to start at school libraries in most other places that I've been following. But this started in our local public library. And my oldest daughter, who is now 26, happens to be part of the LGBTQ community. And the first handful of books that were challenged were all books that affirmed LGBTQ children and families, nothing explicit by any means, and oddly enough, a book on consent. And so when I heard that her name is Hannah Mann Reese was going to the city council and demanding that these books be pulled, I showed up as well, and I spoke directly after her, and I believe that the first words out of my mouth were, "I'm Angie Hayden, and I'm here because I think it's important that you know that there is more than one kind of concerned parent here in Prattville." And that kind of started what became a war over our public library, and that then expanded statewide. As I'm sure you have seen elsewhere, these book challenge efforts, these book banning efforts kind of spread like a cancer, and sort of developed into Read Freely, Alabama, which is now an organization with over 3,000 members in Alabama and chapters all over the state.
And you mentioned Clean Up Prattville. Before that organization became prominent, what would you say the culture surrounding removal of books from public spaces was like in Alabama?
Well, I will say that our public library here in Prattville has existed since the early 60s. And in all of that time, until this controversy, not a single person had ever attended a single library board meeting. I don't really even know of any book challenges that became any sort of controversy. Not to say that there weren't parents who maybe have talked to a librarian about a book here or there over the years, but there really has not been any controversy over the removal of books in this generation. I know that there have been controversies in Alabama previous, mostly involving books about race. That kind of really were solidified for the most part in the Montgomery area. But you know that we're talking about the 60s, and here we are. I guess there's nothing new under the sun, right? We are just repeating history. And although I mentioned that the book started with challenges of LGBTQ material, it did not take them long at all to follow that pattern and start challenging books about race as well.
And when Clean Up Prattville came along and when you started Read Freely, Alabama, what has the community support been like in fighting against censorship?
I have been really pleasantly surprised in that even here in the middle of the heart of Dixie, the majority of people seem to be on the right side of this issue. This group that started out as Clean Up Prattville and is now calling themselves Clean Up Alabama is truly a sister group to Moms for Liberty. They communicate often and plan together. They seem to have a lot of the political backing here in Alabama, unfortunately, with this being such a very red state. But it's been interesting to me and to the rest of my co-founders and our leadership all over the state that this has actually been a very unifying issue for people across the spectrum, across the political spectrum, across the belief spectrum. The vast majority of Alabamians, whether they reside on the right or the left, are in favor of the freedom to access information in their libraries and to make these decisions for their families without government telling them what their children should and should not read based on the whims of extremist groups.
One other thing I did want to touch on, kind of as an outlier, you said that Clean Up Alabama started by targeting public libraries as opposed to schools. Is there anything you could add to that to kind of expand on what their strategy has been and how it kind of differs from other places like Florida where they start with the schools?
Yes, I really believe that Alabama, that Prattville's controversy over the public library was meant to be a bit of a test case for the Moms for Liberty type groups and their cohorts. I think that they've started their attacks on public schools in so many areas, and that has kind of started to run its course. And I think that they decided to try their hand at public libraries because, make no mistake, these groups are not really interested in protecting the children at all. They're interested in walking back any sort of progress that marginalized communities have gained over the years, acceptance in public spaces. They want to push all of that back. They want to kind of take us back several decades. So they start with public schools in some places. They start with public libraries here. And I believe that they, I'm sure, have plans to expand elsewhere as well. Their MO has been, I'm sure, the same that you have seen elsewhere, is to bring a book from the young adult section, not even the children's section, and oftentimes even the adult section of the library, pick a paragraph with some sexual content, read it aloud to kind of scandalize the room, and then say that the librarians are sexualizing your children, they're grooming the children, there's pornography, they say, in the children's section. And that's what they use to kind of get their foot in the door. And from there, they start removing everything that they are ideologically opposed to, really.
And you mentioned the process that they go about by claiming that these are things that are being read to kids or being forced to kids. Whenever the concept of something that is age appropriate comes along, there is a selection process for this kind of thing. And I talk about it a lot, about how librarians in schools typically need a master's degree in library sciences. And there's a lot of training that goes into this. Have you noticed any particular changes with what the process is for raising objections since this group has come along?
I would say, our library here in Prattville has been an incredibly difficult case over the last year. We had a fantastic librarian, and the library board was taken over. And there's only so much I can really talk about that specifically because Read Freely is part now of a federal lawsuit against the current Prattville Library Board. But I will say that the current library board has been taken over by Moms for Liberty, Clean Up Alabama supporters, I would say. And so the process in our library, unfortunately, has become quite different than what it would have been in the past. And we also see these actors being appointed to the state library board at the state level, infiltrated the processes by which our Alabama libraries are operating. The administrative code has been tweaked, and that is kind of an ongoing struggle here as well. So Read Freely has been fighting in individual libraries. We have been fighting at the state level through legislation, and also at the state level through the administrative code process by which Alabama libraries operate. So we've been trying to put out fires on multiple fronts all across the state. So yeah, I'm not sure if that even answers your question really, but yes, the process has been tampered with, and we fear that that's only going to get worse unless we stand up to this extremism.
You mentioned Read Freely Alabama is putting up the fight in libraries and on the state level. When it comes to the community level, are there any ways for your average parents or just concerned citizens to become involved?
Absolutely. Like I mentioned, we do have chapters all across the state. We exist from Huntsville all the way down to Mobile. So we are statewide at this point. And if there's not a Read Freely chapter near you and you feel that there is a need for one, reach out to us. We are happy to help you get started. We can give you the tools. We can give you the information that we have garnered over the last year and a half. And we can help you to become more effective for your libraries. I would say that the first step for anyone, whether you think that your library is being put under attack or not, is to make sure that you're, for one, using your library, get your library card, be a supporter, but start forming a relationship with your library staff. Let them know that you are a friendly face and that you're there. I will say that it's been the hardest year, and I guess suppose going on 2 years for many librarians in the state of Alabama. You're talking about a profession that never expected this sort of controversy and strife, I'm sure. And so I think that they are often left with the impression, since the extremists are so very loud, even though they are few in number, that they are alone in this. So I think that the most important thing you can do for your librarian at the start is to just make sure you're there for them as a friendly face, as a supporter, let them know where you stand, and that is that you stand on their side. If your library is experiencing some controversy, I would say that it becomes critical that you start forming relationships with your library board, your city council, your county commission, whatever municipality controls the funding for your library. Start making inroads with those people so that they are not only hearing from the extremists, because I can tell you from our experience here in Prattville that sometimes the reasonable majority is a little more quiet than maybe we need to be. And so the thing about extremists is that they show up. They are very dedicated to their cause. And so it becomes very difficult, I think, for politicians to stand up against that sort of constant phone call campaign, that constant letter writing campaign, the constant presence of these people at public meetings where they are reading a titillating bit from a book from the teenage section and telling everyone that it's for the children. So really, I think that my takeaway for people listening would be to show up, because if we aren't showing up the way that Moms for Liberty is showing up, then we're handing it to them.
When it comes to challenging book bans in Alabama, have there been any surprising or standout challenges that have been made? Any specific titles that just kind of give you a what kind of response?
Oh, yes. We had a book make national headlines in North Alabama. It somehow got filtered out and moved, and the last name of the author was gay. It was not a controversial book. It was a children's book. It was not a controversial book, but apparently there was something run through the filter somewhere, and they were targeting books with the keyword gay. We were kind of the butt of late night TV jokes that week. There have been challenges to a book called Red, a crayon story. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but this book is about a crayon that finds himself in the wrong wrapper. The author says that it's about his struggle with dyslexia and how he could not live up to the expectations that people had of him. But Clean Up Alabama and Moms for Liberty insist that the author is wrong and that it is about transgender issues. We had a book challenged, I believe, in Dothan. Someone wrote a letter, a Moms for Liberty sympathizer wrote a letter, and I will make a note that this book is an adult book. It's a commentary on history. It's in the adult section, and it is titled "The Southernization of America." And the quote from the book, the person who wanted this book pulled, was that it was critical of traditional Southern culture and white people. We have had challenges against the book The Hate You Give, which is an incredibly important book. In my opinion, it should almost be required reading for high school and college students. It's about racial justice and police violence. We had one of the very, very first books challenged here in Prattville is a book for toddlers called Yes, No, A First Conversation on Consent. And this book is simply about teaching children that their body belongs to them. They don't have to let anyone touch it if they don't want a hug, that sort of thing. And we have a copy of the challenge form, although the person's name is, of course, redacted. And the reason they challenged it was because they say it teaches children that they must consent to anything done with them, specifically sexual. So the surprises have been constant, and it often gets to the point where I feel like I cannot be further shocked, but then somehow they still end up topping themselves. I still find myself amazed at the rationale behind many of these book challenges, whether it be a book about consent or whether it be a book for teenagers about a girl who has survived sexual assault, where they will pull a single paragraph from the retelling of her assault and make it seem as if it's supposed to be titillating instead of horrifying. So it really makes you wonder, when they start to target books that are meant to aid teenage girls who are suffering from sexual abuse, and when they are targeting books that are meant to teach children that their body belongs to them, it makes you wonder who actually might be the groomer.
Right, because these books are meant to empower victims to be able to speak out. And
Absolutely.
that is a troubling thing to try and censor.
Truly. And when it comes to sex education books that simply teach children the proper names for their body parts, those types of books, while any parent is free to disallow their children from picking them up and reading them, they are critical. It is critical for children to understand the names of their bodies so that, God forbid, something should happen to them, they have the language to tell someone what is happening to them and to make someone aware so that they can make it stop.
What would you say is the biggest benefit in protecting the freedom to read for Read Freely Alabama?
Oh my goodness. That's such a foundational, it's supposed to be such a foundational idea to our country, right? The freedom, not only of speech, but freedom to access information, the freedom to be able to walk into your library and pick up a book that suits you, that you find a need for, without that being infringed upon. And when you look at the pattern that is already starting to happen, and this is, like I said, here in Alabama, this round of book banning is fairly new. We've already spiraled from supposedly sexually explicit materials to books about bodily autonomy and sex education, and now racial justice. You have to ask, where does that end? And that, to me, is such an important fight. I think that when this first started, maybe a few people wondered why I was taking it as seriously as I am. But, in addition to all of that, which should be reason enough, when you consider the types of books that are being targeted about children who happen to belong in at-risk, marginalized groups, how critical it is for them to see literature that represents them, and what a difference that makes in, the rates of suicide in young people. That is, I can't think of anything more important than that. And that's why, to me, it's so ironic that their line is that they're seeking to protect the children. And my question to them would be, which children are you protecting? Because it's not children like mine. It's not children who are suffering from abuse and have nowhere to go or even the words to use for that. It's certainly not Black and brown children that they are worried about protecting. So yeah, that would be my question to them. Whose children are you trying to protect, and from what?
Now, Angie, what would you say, or what would you consider to be the biggest win for Read Freely Alabama?
Last legislative session, we were able to help defeat some pretty terrible bills. One which we referred to as the Jail the Librarians bill, and it was narrowly defeated. The bad news is that it's already pre-filed for the next legislative session. It's HB4. I'm sending you a link, and anyone can Google Alabama HB4. And this was sponsored by Representative Mooney. And what it purports to do is, of course, to protect the children. And what they would like for you to think is that it removes the exemptions that libraries have for inappropriate content for children. But that kind of buries the lead, because at the same time, they are tweaking the definition of what is, quote, inappropriate children. And it really does make it very likely that Alabama librarians could end up facing charges for not removing some of these books. And the way this the bill is written, is that one of these Moms for Liberty, Clean Up Alabama people could go to your local library and object to yes, no, a first conversation on consent. The library director then has 15 days to either move it to a restricted section, remove it from the library completely, or determine that the book doesn't violate policy. However, they now have to notify the original complainant within 5 days, and beyond that point, that complainant can then go straight to law enforcement in that county or municipality. And the way the bill is written, there does not seem to be any way for the librarian to defend themselves or that book at that point. And then a warrant or an indictment can be ordered. It also includes some incredibly problematic language that could affect library staff. It prohibits, and this is a direct quote from the bill, gender-oriented conduct or presentation or exaggerated clothing. And when I think of the many fantastic library staff throughout the state who may just simply not be gender conforming, who maybe do not dress in a traditionally gender conforming way. And some of these workers have, make no mistake, already been harassed by some of these people. That puts them at direct risk of, I suppose, just it becomes a risk of them becoming illegal just to exist in the library. So we are very committed to directing every resource we have toward educating the public about this pre-filed bill and defeating it.
Thank you, Angie. That has been an interview with Angie Hayden from Read Freely Alabama. You can learn more about their project at readfreelyalabama.org. Next up, we're going to be looking at some legislation that is pre-filed in the state of Texas for the 2025 legislative session. But first, if you wish to help the podcast grow, you can leave a review or rating wherever you're listening, or share the podcast with a friend, an educator, or a young reader in your life. Of course, you can also follow the podcast on Blue Sky at bookfairpod.bluesky.social. In the state of Texas, pre-file for legislation began in November. Since then, there have been over 2,000 bills introduced in the House of Representatives and the Senate. This is by far not a comprehensive list. This is just a few highlights of bills that I was able to find from legiscan.com. I will be updating this as we go through if there are any new bills introduced and whether or not a bill passes or is introduced that will affect schools and libraries in the state of Texas, as well as other states across the country. Beginning first with Texas House Bill 1569, this bill was filed by Representative John Busey from District 136, which is located in the northern Austin, Round Rock, and Cedar Park area. This bill is an amendment to an existing law that provides preschool education to certain children who meet specific criteria. This bill would give free preschool education to children who have guardians or parents that are educators or teachers. That is a very good thing. The next bill is from Representative Steve Toth, and that is House Bill 1553. Steve Toth represents the 15th District in the state of Texas. This bill would reduce the amount of property taxes that schools would be able to collect for funding purposes, essentially reducing the amount of funding for public schools. Next up is Senate Bill 558 from Senator Nathan Johnson of District 16. This bill allows for charter schools to be designated as, quote, full-service community school. This amendment would require charter schools to adhere to educational and extracurricular standards in order to receive public funding. While I have mixed feelings about private institutions receiving public funds, having them adhere to the same standards for education would ultimately benefit those communities. Nathan Johnson also filed Senate Bill 559, which requires schools with 300 or more students to employ a certified counselor where the current law does not currently specify certification and only affects schools with 500 or more students. Nathan Johnson, again with Senate Bill 557, expands funding per student enrolled in pathways in technology early colleges, high schools, or P-Tech to $159 per student, currently $50 per student. If you're curious and live in the state of Texas, Nathan Johnson is a senator out of Houston. So if you wish to show support and are a constituent from District 16, I recommend checking out texas.gov and looking up your senator and your congressman for local elections and wishing that they support these bills that would benefit students. Next up, from Senator Jose Mendez of District 26 in San Antonio, Senate Bill 549, which would give a 20% increase in funding allotments of public funding to the fine arts. That's a big plus for me. I love that. Next, we're getting up into some of these scary bills like House Bill 1481 from Representative Caroline Fairley of District 87. This is a proposed bill to force school districts to restrict access to cell phones. Next up is House Bill 1484 from Representative Terry Leo Wilson, a woman from District 23. This bill is titled the Sexual Grooming Protection Act. Quote, a parent who determines that their child is subjected to sexual grooming at a public school is entitled to the right to protect their child from such sexual grooming by selecting another school, public or private, for their child, in which event Chapter 48 funding for the education of that child shall flow with the child to the new school selected by the parents. Section 38.402 definition: sexual grooming is defined as any effort to desensitize children to sexual experiences or to normalize sexual relationships with adults or children of the same or opposite sex. The main tactic of these bills is vague language, claiming that grooming can be defined as the normalization of relationships with adults or children of the same or opposite sex. Basically means that any married couple or anybody who is in a relationship around children could be called sexual grooming. These vague bills are harmful to education and withholds funding if enacted as written. Schools are not well funded in the United States and should not be threatened with further defunding. Next up, from Carl Tepper of District 84, Texas House Bill 1457. Adopts a resolution for Texas Board of Education to require 1 credit in, quote, modern conflict, which is absolutely wild. I would recommend looking up House Bill 1457 and reading it for yourself. because this is essentially a military propaganda class. The final bill that I will highlight comes from District 131 Representative Alma Allen, Texas House Bill 1415, which prohibits administration of corporal punishment in schools. I would like to believe that the idea of harming children as a means of discipline in public schools is not a good idea. This will conclude a brief look at some of the 2,000 bills introduced in pre-file legislation for Texas in the 2025 89th Representative Legislative Session. There are plenty more to go over, and I will hopefully be able to give any highlights to bills that are relevant as they are introduced on the House floor, debated, or even voted upon throughout the United States. And now I'd like to close out the episode by looking at some recent releases, beginning with X Marks the Spot by Gloria Chao. Taiwanese-American 18-year-old Gemma Sun is used to being considered boring and socially awkward, especially compared to her popular and charismatic Taiwanese-American ex-boyfriend Xander Pan, whom she detests after an unpleasant breakup, and whose connection to their culture she envies. Then she's contacted by an attorney who tells her that her grandfather recently died, and that he left Gemma and old newspaper clippings with a secret message prompting her to visit his apartment in Taipei. The news causes rifts between Gemma and her mother. She told Gemma that he died a long time ago, and Gemma now blames her for her loneliness and disconnect with her heritage. Reluctantly, she enlists Xander, whose involvement in the Taiwanese-American Roots Pursuit program helped secure Gemma a trip to Taiwan. As a non-Mandarin speaker, Gemma struggles to decipher her grandfather's elaborate clues, prompting Xander to persuade Gemma into letting him help her in exchange for part of whatever's at the end of the search. What follows is a whirlwind adventure through Taipei, which Chao depicts using vivid prose that details Taiwanese tourist life alongside a simmering second-chance romance. This book is recommended for ages 12 and up. Next up, We Are Lion Dancers by Benson Shum. At their Kung Fu club, siblings Lily and Noah spot a colorful lion dance costume. The dancers, who use kicks and other Kung Fu moves in their dancing, have arrived to practice for the upcoming Lunar New Year parade. While the kids marvel at the costume's soft fur and bright colors, a performer explains in straightforward text how the dance scares away evil spirits and brings good luck and happiness, and outlines details about how the lion dance proceeds. After a successful practice, with Lily on the gong and Noah picking up the cymbals, the kids head home to create their own costume before, at the parade, receiving a special surprise. With easy-to-read text and energetic illustrations, Shum creates an informative lion dance primer that emphasizes community and teamwork. A note on the dance's origin concludes. This book is recommended for ages 5 to 7. Next up is The Losting Fountain by Lora Senf. 3 teens from different time periods discover a mythical island of lost things in this dark fantasy from Senf. In 1913, 14-year-old Ember is visited by a magical winged girl named Selah, who spirits her to the Losting Fountain, a vast, untamed island that's home to mythical creatures, some deadly, and lost things longing to be found. In 1989, 15-year-old Sam, encouraged by strange voices, runs away from home to the same island. And in the present day, 17-year-old Miles flees to the island with 2 winged guides, seeking answers about his birth mother. The 3 timelines converge via waterway, allowing Ember, Sam, and Miles to meet on the island outside of time. But dangerous creatures seek to escape, through a rip between the lusting fountain and the human world. Each teen has a role to play in repairing the border, but the personal connections to the island could jeopardize their missions. The characters' alternating perspectives sometimes read as overly similar, and thinly connected storylines hamper an interesting premise. Nevertheless, a devious twist, gloriously horrific monsters, and gentle explorations of grief bring this fable to an emotional close. This book is recommended for ages 14 and up. And the final new release for this week, Visitations by Egbert. In this searing graphic novel memoir, Egbert details his crisis of faith in Mormonism, and in his mother, following an allegation that his father has been sexually abusing his younger sister Sarah. After their maternal grandfather is accused of child molestation, Sarah refuses to be put to bed by their father, claiming, quote, "Daddy tickles me." Though Egbert's parents divorce, the court finds no evidence of abuse and orders visitation with their dad. Their mom is deeply upset about this and prays about it often, asking for guidance, which she one day claims to receive from the Heavenly Father himself. She leaves town with the kids, hiding them from police by sleeping in their car in isolated places. Meanwhile, Egbert dreams of a mysterious girl he yearns to communicate with, and in his waking life fears becoming like his father. Via intimate narration, the creator chronicles the true story of his parents' divorce and his mother's struggles with her mental health, as well as religion's role in his compliance with her actions. A non-linear timeline layered with lightly mystical elements rendered in muted pastels conveys a compelling emotional journey through a formative traumatic experience. An author's note and resources conclude. This book is recommended for ages 12 and up. This concludes another episode of the Book Fair podcast. I'd like to remind you that I will be taking a couple of weeks off for the holidays and will be returning in the new year with more episodes of the Book Fair. If you appreciate the work being done here, please leave a review or rating wherever you're listening and share the podcast with a friend, a relative, or a young reader in your life. Thank you very much for listening, and as always, I'll talk at you next time.